The diner door creaked open at 7:15 a.m., sharp as always. Clara didn't need to check. She knew it was him, the same frail man in the tweed cap and beige coat, worn down by time but too proud to show it. His steps were deliberate, his expression unreadable, and he always took booth 6 by the window, where the sunlight would hit the glass just right. She watched as he carefully pulled out a handkerchief to wipe the seat before sitting down. The ritual never changed. He placed a small coin pouch on the table, folded his napkin into a crisp triangle, and waited without saying a word. Clara approached with a pot of coffee, her apron already stained with syrup and memories. She smiled, soft but tired. "The usual, sir?" A small nod. That was all she ever got. Pouring the coffee into the chipped white cup, she asked, "No cream? No sugar?" Still, no words. Another nod. Clara turned away, but something tugged at her. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered on the falling leaves outside, or the way his hand trembled slightly when he lifted the cup. She knew people like him, quiet souls fading in the noise of the world. She had watched her mother disappear the same way when life got too heavy. After her shift, Clara wiped booth 6 slower than usual. She stared at the faint ring his cup always left on the table. "Who are you?" she whispered, as if the silence would suddenly speak. The next morning, he came again. Same time, same booth. This time, Clara placed a daisy from the kitchen garden beside his cup. Not because she expected anything, but because the table looked too bare. He didn't react, didn't even glance at it. But he left a dime instead, of a penny with the tip. By the end of the week, Clara had fallen into her own ritual. A new flower each day. A moment of quiet before her shift roared with orders and complaints. She didn't realize it, but something about serving him filled a space in her she didn't know was empty. Then one morning, she noticed something strange. He was already sitting in the booth when she arrived to open. The diner didn't unlock until 7. How had he gotten in? She walked over, trying not to show concern. "You okay, sir?" He didn't answer, just stared ahead. Did you sleep here?" Still no reply. But his eyes, once distant, looked a little lost now. Clara crouched beside the booth, careful not to startle him. "You can tell me if something's wrong. I won't tell anyone." His lips parted slightly, but all that came out was a dry whisper. "Just cold." It hit her then. He had nowhere to go. Clara wanted to ask more, but he looked away, ashamed. So she stood, poured his coffee, and placed it down along with 2 slices of toast from her own lunch bag. "Eat," she said gently. "It's on me today." That morning, the flower was a yellow marigold. And for the first time, as he stood to leave, he paused. His hand trembled slightly as he placed the dime down, then another, 2 coins now, and, without looking at her, said, "Thank you, miss." It was the first time he'd spoken a word to her. Clara stood frozen behind the counter, blinking back the sting in her eyes. A shift had begun, not just in their routine, but inside her. She didn't know why yet, but something was changing, and she would keep showing up. Because somehow, in that shared silence and brief warmth, they were both being stitched back together. 1. Coffee at a time. It was raining the first morning he didn't show up, Cold, slanted rain that slapped the glass of Daisy's diner like urgent hands, demanding to be let in. Clara stood behind the counter, eyes drifting to booth 6 between coffee orders and half-hearted smiles. At 7:15, her breath hitched, almost instinctively, but the door didn't open. The bell stayed silent. By 7:20, she told herself maybe he was running late. At 7:30, she poured a black coffee anyway and placed it on the table with a violet from the diner garden. It looked lonely, a tiny island of routine in a sea of questions. "He not coming today?" asked Hank, the dishwasher, as he scrubbed plates behind her. Clara shrugged, trying to seem indifferent. Maybe the rain kept him home. But something deep inside her shifted, like a chair pulled out from under her when she wasn't ready to sit. He had never missed a day, not even when snow clung to boots and the wind bit through coats. He was always there. Always. The next morning she opened early, hoping she'd find him waiting again like before. But the booth was empty. The cup stayed dry. The air in the diner felt colder than usual, even though the heater rattled in the ceiling like it always did. She left the coffee anyway. A daisy this time. It wilted by noon. That night, Clara lay awake in her tiny apartment above the grocery store. Her brother's soft snoring drifted through the paper-thin walls, but she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the man she didn't really know. George. She started calling him that in her mind. He looked like a George, old-fashioned, stubborn, but gentle beneath it all. The absence grew heavier by the day. 3 days passed, then 5. By the end of the week, Clara was placing a flower on the table more out of grief than hope, her manager noticed. "You know, it's okay to let that table go. He's not coming back," she said softly, trying not to sound harsh. But Clara shook her head. "It's not about waiting for him," she replied. "It's about remembering he was here." That answer didn't make much sense to anyone else, but to Clara, it was everything. She tried to find out more. She asked the postman if he'd ever seen an old man in a tweed coat walking down Maple Street, asked the grocery clerk across the block if he knew of anyone named George. No one had answers. No one had noticed him. The realization gnawed at her. He had lived so invisibly that even in his disappearance, no one missed him but her. One afternoon, after the lunch rush, Clara sat down in booth 6 herself. She stared out the window, rain streaking down like veins on glass. She wrapped her hands around the empty coffee cup and whispered, "I should have asked your name." That night, she wrote something in her journal she hadn't touched in months. "If I disappear one day, will anyone leave a flower for me?" The question sat with her like a second shadow. Then came the twist. A week later, a plain envelope arrived at the diner, addressed in blocky handwriting. To the waitress with the kind smile. No return address, no stamp. It had been slid under the door. Clara opened it with trembling fingers, her heart pounding. Inside was a short letter. "He spoke of you often. He's gone now, but he remembered. Come Sunday, 11 a.m., Grace Hill Cemetery. He wanted you there." It wasn't signed. Clara sat in the back room, hands shaking, the paper fluttering in her lap. Her heart ached in a way that felt deeper than she could explain. The silence had never felt so loud. And now she had to decide. Was she ready to say goodbye to someone she never really knew, but somehow had come to care for? She looked at booth 6 one last time. Yes, she whispered. And this time, she left a white lily. Clara hadn't been to a funeral since her mother's. The morning of George's service, she stood in front of her mirror for what felt like hours. She'd borrowed a black dress from her neighbor, pinned her curls back, and applied a thin line of eyeliner with trembling hands. There was no real reason to feel nervous, she told herself. She wasn't family. She hadn't even known his last name. But as she slipped the folded letter into her purse, she felt something tug at her chest. A quiet ache she couldn't name. Something more than sadness. Something like unfinished conversation. The cemetery sat at the edge of town, lined with skeletal trees that danced in the cold wind. The sky above was a dull gray, as if even the heavens mourned without words. Clara arrived early, unsure of where to stand or what to expect. A handful of mourners, most older, a few in worn coats, gathered near the modest wooden casket under the canopy. She hovered at the back, feeling like an imposter. An elderly woman with lavender gloves approached her and gently touched her arm. "You're Clara, aren't you?" Her voice was soft but direct. Clara blinked. "How did you—" The woman smiled sadly. "I'm Ellen. I used to be George's lawyer. He spoke of you in the letters he gave me before he passed. Said you were the only person who made him feel like a man again, like he mattered." The words caught Clara off guard. I only served him coffee." "No," Ellen said, gently but firmly. "You served him dignity." The ceremony began. The pastor spoke briefly, formally, almost distant. George's life was summarized in a few lines. Former architect, widower, father to a son he hadn't seen in decades. No mention of the diner, no mention of daisies. Clara felt invisible again, like her piece of his story didn't belong. But then something happened. After the service, as people trickled away, a tall man in a brown coat approached her. He was younger than George, maybe in his early 40s, with graying temples and wary eyes. He looked like someone carrying a story too heavy to tell. "I believe this is for you," he said, pulling a small velvet pouch from his coat pocket. He left it with Ellen, but he insisted it be given by me. Said it'd make more sense. Clara hesitated, staring at the pouch. "Why me?" The man gave a strange, sad smile. "Because he didn't want you to feel like your kindness ended." In silence. She slowly opened the pouch and found a single brass key. Old, slightly tarnished, warm from his hand. She looked up. "What does it open?" "A place you didn't know you were part of," he replied. "Follow the address Ellen gives you. When you get there, maybe you'll find the answers I never cared to ask." Then he turned and walked away without another word. Clara stared down at the key, her pulse rising. Her thoughts raced. What kind of man leaves a stranger something like this? What secrets had George buried in silence? And why had he chosen her? She turned to Ellen, who stood quietly near the casket. "He never told me anything personal," Clara whispered. "I didn't know him. Not really." Ellen looked at her with a kindness that had weight. "You knew the part of him that mattered most. Not everyone gets that." As the wind picked up, Clara clutched the key in her palm and walked slowly back to her car, unsure whether to feel honored or terrified. She glanced once more at the wooden casket, now lowered into the ground. Whatever door this key opened, she would face it. Because sometimes the quietest goodbyes lead to the loudest revelations. The directions Ellen gave her led Clara far beyond the familiar parts of town, past rusting fences, broken sidewalks, and eventually into the hush of the countryside. Her small car struggled against the gravel road, tires crunching over stones as tall grass brushed the undercarriage. The air felt different here, still, like time had paused. She finally reached the end of the lane, where a weathered wooden mailbox leaned sideways, barely holding a name. Faded letters carved into the side read, G. Rowley. Clara stepped out and approached the house. It stood half swallowed by ivy and neglect, but somehow it still held its dignity, just like George had. The shutters were crooked, the paint peeled, in long strips, but the bones of the house were strong. She paused on the creaking porch, hesitating with the key in her hand. The brass was cold against her skin. What if it didn't fit? What if she had imagined the connection between them, and this was just some cruel misstep? But the lock turned with an easy click. The door creaked open, revealing a wall of silence and dust. She stepped inside slowly. The air smelled of old paper and cedar. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, illuminating motes that danced like memories. It wasn't a grand house, but every detail held intention. Worn leather chairs, a mantel covered in dust and framed photographs turned face down, books lined, the shelves, spines cracked from love. A grandfather clock had long since stopped ticking. Clara felt like she had walked into the past, a version of George's life that had waited patiently to be seen. On the kitchen table, a yellow envelope rested atop a folded quilt. Her name was written in tight script. She opened it with trembling fingers. Clara, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and the key worked. I always believed that homes are made by the presence of love, not the absence of loneliness. This house was once full of laughter, music, and the soft voice of my wife calling me in for dinner. When she died, it became a place I came to forget. You made me remember again. This house is yours now, not because of pity or a whim, but because you offered me more in 10 minutes each day than most did in decades. I saw how tired you were. I saw how hard you worked. And I saw kindness in you that deserved a second chance at peace. Make it your own. Make it a place where people are seen. George. Tears slipped down Clara's face before she could stop them. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands cradling the letter like something sacred. The man who barely spoke had left behind a roar of love. He had seen her when she thought no one did. But the house wasn't empty of echoes. As she explored room by room, she found sketches of buildings, blueprints, and paintings of lighthouses. George had been an architect, not just in career, but in heart. He built things meant to last. Then she found the spare bedroom. It had been left untouched for years, but it was clean, almost expectant. On the desk was a stack of unsent letters, her name written across the top one. You reminded me what it felt like to be noticed. Every time you left a flower, I felt like I hadn't disappeared completely. I wanted to tell you, but fear keeps. Quiet people quieter. The words broke her. This was more than a gift. It was trust. It was memory. It was belonging. As night fell, Clara stood on the porch, staring at the stars that now felt closer somehow. This wasn't just a house. It was A doorway, and it was waiting for her to walk through. The attic door groaned as Clara pulled it open, releasing a breath of stale air and forgotten memories. Dust shimmered in the shaft of afternoon light as she climbed the narrow stairs. Her footsteps echoed, each creak beneath her feet, whispering, a piece of someone else's story. She didn't know what she was searching for, only that George had left something behind. Something more than furniture, more than a key. She felt it in her chest, like unfinished music waiting for the final note. At the top of the stairs, the attic unfolded like a frozen moment in time. Stacks of boxes, trunks sealed with rusted clasps, old furniture draped in sheets. It smelled of cedar and faded newspaper ink. And then, in the corner under a small round window, sat a wooden chest, not locked, just waiting. Clara knelt before it, heart pounding, and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all sealed, all marked with the same careful handwriting, and all addressed to her. Her breath caught. Some were dated a year ago, some just months. The earliest one read, "To the waitress with the tired eyes." Hands trembling, she opened the first envelope. "You don't know me, but I know you see me, and that has been enough to keep breathing." She read slowly, word by word, heart cracking open. The next letter. "Today you left a marigold. I haven't seen a marigold since my wife's funeral. You didn't know that, but you brought her back for a moment." Every page was a window into George's soul. A man who had lived a quiet life full of loud grief. He wrote about his estranged son, how pride had built walls too high to climb. He wrote about his wife, Marianne, who had loved thunderstorms and blueberry jam and used to sing off-key in the garden. And he wrote about Clara. Over and over, he thanked her. "Your kindness was so small I almost missed it. But when the world feels cold, even a warm cup becomes a miracle." Clara sat there for hours, tears soaking through the thin paper, letter after letter tearing and mending her heart all at once. But it was the final envelope, thicker, different, that changed everything. It wasn't a letter. It was a will, and a blueprint. George had drafted a design for the house, an extension, a renovation, a vision. At the bottom was a note. "You once asked me if I believed in starting over. I didn't then. But you changed that. I want this house to become something. Again, a home, a place where the forgotten can be remembered. If you can make it happen, do." Clara pressed the blueprint against her chest, shaking. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt chosen. Not by luck, but by someone who had truly seen her soul. Still, conflict twisted inside her. She was just a waitress. She barely made rent. How was she supposed to turn a decaying house into a place of healing? And yet, hadn't George seen something in her no one else had? She descended the stairs slowly, the letters bundled in her arms like treasures. As she reached the living room, the afternoon light had shifted, casting golden warmth over the wooden floors. She saw the house differently now, not as a tomb of the past, but as a seed for something new. That night, Clara stood by the old fireplace, letters spread around her, George's blueprint open on the table. "I don't know how yet," she whispered, voice quivering, "but I will build this. Not for herself alone, but for every soul like George, every person quietly waiting to be seen. 6 months passed. The house had changed, but not as much as Clara had. The peeling walls were painted soft shades of honey and sage. The attic had been turned into a reading nook, filled with secondhand books, including some of George's favorite architecture journals. The spare bedroom now held a donated armchair and a handmade quilt, always warm, always waiting. But it wasn't just a home anymore. It was becoming what George dreamed of. A haven. Clara had named it Booth 6, a quiet tribute, though only she knew the meaning. Officially, it was a community cafe and reading space with a sign out front that read, "Come as you are, stay as you need." It started small. A single mom came in one afternoon, rain clinging to her coat and tears to her lashes. Clara poured her a free cup of tea and sat beside her until the silence softened. A retired teacher dropped off a stack of books with a note, "In case someone needs to escape for a while." A teenage boy who usually skated alone in the park now spent his afternoons curled up by the fireplace, writing songs no one else had heard. Clara didn't advertise. She didn't need to. The place whispered through the town like a secret worth keeping. Still, not everything came easily. Money was tight. Renovations took longer than expected. Clara had to give up her job at the diner, though she returned once a week to help on Sundays, just to keep a promise to her roots. Some nights, she lay awake, worrying if she'd made a terrible mistake. What if it all failed? What if she had misunderstood George's gift? But each time doubt crept in, something happened. Small, invisible miracles that reminded her she wasn't walking alone. One evening, as she was locking up, she found a letter slipped under the door. "You don't know me, but I knew George. I'm his son." Clara froze. She opened the envelope slowly, heart pounding. Inside was a handwritten note, the penmanship uneven but full of weight. "I resented him, for years, for leaving, for choosing silence instead of reconciliation. But then I heard about you, about this place. I came by once, didn't introduce myself, just watched through the window. And I saw it. I saw the part of him that survived, through you. Thank you for seeing what I couldn't, and for giving him peace I was too late to offer." There was no signature, just an address. Clara stood on the porch in the quiet night, the letter clutched to her chest. For a long time she didn't move. She just looked up at the stars. The same stars George had watched, the same sky they both once sat beneath in, silence. Something shifted inside her. Not closure, something deeper. Connection. And she finally understood. George hadn't chosen her because she was special. He had chosen her because she saw the part of him that still wanted to be found. She didn't save him. They had saved each other. Weeks later, a new plaque was mounted above the fireplace. It read, "For the unseen, the unheard, and the quietly kind. Booth 6 will always have room." And every morning, Clara placed a daisy in a tiny vase on the front table. Not because she was waiting, but because someone, somewhere, might need to know they're not invisible. Not today. Not here. Not anymore.